Imagine losing everything to a ruthless corporate shark. What if your unique profession gave you the power to see the hidden lies that destroyed your family? This is the story of a pathologist who conducted an intellectual autopsy on deceit, revealing the corporate rot beneath a pristine public image. Dr. Margaret Vance moved through the hushed halls of the city morgue with a quiet precision, her presence as sharp and observant as the gleaming instruments laid out on her stainless steel tables. As a forensic pathologist, she dealt in facts, in the undeniable truths whispered by the deceased. Her world was one of meticulous detail, where every incision and every stained slide offered irrefutable evidence. Outside the sterile environment of her lab, however, lay a bitter truth that defied logical examination: the systematic dismantling of her family's esteemed pharmaceutical company, Vance Therapeutics, by a ruthless corporate raider, Sterling Innovations, spearheaded by its enigmatic CEO, Alasdair Sterling. Vance Therapeutics had been more than just a business. It was a legacy, built by generations of her family on a foundation of ethical research and genuine patient care. Alasdair Sterling, with his slick public image and predatory acquisition tactics, had orchestrated a hostile takeover, flooding the market with false rumors about the company's integrity and manipulating stock prices until the family was forced to sell for a pittance. The fallout was devastating. Margaret's elderly father, the patriarch of Vance Therapeutics, suffered a debilitating stroke brought on by the immense stress and humiliation. Her siblings scattered, their lives uprooted, their trust in the corporate world shattered. The once vibrant family home, filled with laughter and scientific debate, became a monument to what was lost, cloaked in a heavy shroud of quiet despair. Legal avenues proved futile. Sterling Innovations had insulated itself behind layers of shell corporations and high-priced lawyers, their methods technically legal, ethically bankrupt. But Margaret, unlike her family, did not succumb to despair. She possessed a unique understanding of the human body, of how subtle external factors could leave indelible internal marks. And she understood Alasdair Sterling's greatest vulnerability: his carefully constructed, almost impenetrable public image of a visionary, ethical leader. Her retribution would not be swift or overtly violent. It would be a slow, methodical dissection, a forensic unearthing of the hidden deceits that would expose the true nature of the man who had torn her family apart, much like an autopsy reveals the unseen cause of demise. She would use the precision of her craft to lay bare the corporate pathology of Sterling Innovations. Margaret's unique expertise in pathology offered her an unconventional, yet potent, avenue for investigation. She understood that even the most meticulously hidden corporate misdeeds could leave microscopic traces, much like toxins in a human body. Her plan began with a deep dive into the public-facing products of Sterling Innovations, particularly a series of new, seemingly groundbreaking supplements and wellness products that Alasdair Sterling had heavily promoted as revolutionary. These products, launched shortly after the acquisition of Vance Therapeutics, promised miraculous results but seemed to lack the rigorous, ethical testing that had been the hallmark of her family's company. Margaret, driven by a quiet, methodical fury, began to acquire samples of these products through various untraceable channels, including anonymous online purchases and even by discreetly obtaining discarded packaging from public waste bins near Sterling Innovations' public events. Back in her meticulously organized private lab, a space few knew existed outside the morgue, Margaret began a series of intricate, almost obsessive, chemical analyses. She wasn't looking for overtly illegal substances, which would have been too obvious and easily covered up. Instead, she was searching for subtle discrepancies, inconsistencies in ingredient lists versus actual content, traces of compounds that were technically permitted but known to cause minor, cumulative side effects, or substances whose long-term effects were not fully understood and were being marketed with reckless abandon. She focused on the precise ratios of active ingredients, the quality of excipients, and the presence of unexpected contaminants, however minute. Her specialized equipment, usually reserved for complex forensic cases, hummed softly as she meticulously documented every finding, cross-referencing against industry standards, internal company documents, which she discreetly accessed through leaked, publicly available corporate filings, and published scientific literature. What she began to uncover was not a single grand fraud, but a pattern of subtle, systemic corner-cutting. Cheaper, less effective forms of ingredients being used while marketing claimed premium quality, and a disturbing lack of transparent, long-term safety studies for certain combinations. Each finding, on its own, might have been dismissed as a minor regulatory oversight. But together, they painted a picture of a company prioritizing profit over patient well-being, a stark contrast to the ethical standards Aleister Stirling so publicly espoused. These were the digital equivalent of microscopic lesions, invisible to the casual observer but screaming volumes to the trained eye. Margaret knew that simply having scientific data, no matter how compelling, was insufficient for her purpose. It needed context. It needed a narrative that would resonate far beyond the confines of a lab. She began to discreetly follow online health communities and consumer advocacy groups, specifically those discussing new supplements and wellness products. She observed a subtle, yet growing, undercurrent of anecdotal complaints about the very products she was analyzing from Stirling Innovations. Persistent headaches, unexplained fatigue, mild digestive issues, or a general feeling of malaise that users attributed to stress or other factors, never suspecting the new miracle supplement they were taking. These complaints were often dismissed as isolated incidents or placebo effects, but Margaret's forensic mind recognized the pattern. She then meticulously crafted a series of anonymous online posts, not as Margaret Vance, but as a concerned healthcare professional or a meticulous consumer. These posts were always phrased as questions or observations, never direct accusations. For instance, she might ask, "Has anyone else noticed a strange synergy between product A and product B from Stirling Innovations, particularly concerning minor symptom?" Or, "I'm curious about the long-term data for specific ingredient when combined with another ingredient as found in new wellness lines. Any published studies beyond the company's?" She referenced obscure scientific papers or public databases that subtly supported her implied concerns, knowing that curious minds would follow the breadcrumbs. She also started engaging with independent health bloggers and investigative journalists who focused on consumer product safety. Her interactions were always professional, providing just enough verifiable, publicly available information, like patent filings or ingredient lists, to pique their interest, suggesting areas for their own independent research, without directly stating her findings or revealing her identity. She supplied them with the precise batch numbers of the products she had acquired, knowing that independent testing labs would be able to replicate her findings if given the right starting point. The goal was to build a decentralized, organic groundswell of skepticism, allowing external, credible voices to connect the dots and ultimately expose the truth about Stirling Innovations' ethically questionable practices, effectively using their public-facing products as the Achilles heel of Aleister Stirling's carefully curated image. The narrative was slowly, meticulously being woven, thread by thread, from the very fabric of his deceit. The groundswell Margaret had so carefully cultivated finally broke through the surface with a resounding impact. A prominent investigative journalist, known for her tenacity and deep dives into corporate misconduct, published a scathing exposé. Her article, titled "The Bitter Pill: Are Stirling Innovations Wellness Claims Making You Sicker?", meticulously outlined the anecdotal evidence from hundreds of consumers, cross-referenced with publicly available scientific literature, and the precise batch numbers provided anonymously by Margaret. The article didn't directly accuse, but rather raised serious, meticulously documented questions about the long-term safety and efficacy of Stirling Innovations' flagship wellness line, highlighting the discrepancies between advertised ingredients and actual content, mirroring Margaret's own lab findings. The journalist subtly suggested that a pattern of prioritizing cost-cutting over rigorous testing was emerging. The article went viral, amplified by the very consumer advocacy groups and health bloggers Margaret had engaged with. Social media exploded with angry testimonials from users who suddenly recognized their vague symptoms in the article's descriptions. Hashtags questioning Stirling Innovations' ethics trended nationwide. The carefully crafted image of Aleister Stirling as a health visionary began to crumble under the weight of public outrage and scientific skepticism. Competitors, smelling blood in the water, quickly initiated their own comparative studies, which, predictably, confirmed many of the journalists' concerns. The pressure mounted. Regulatory bodies, initially slow to react, were now inundated with complaints and public demands for action. They initiated formal investigations into Sterling Innovations' manufacturing practices and marketing claims. Alastair Sterling, once unflappable, appeared visibly shaken during public appearances, his rehearsed answers failing to quell the rising tide of doubt. He tried to dismiss the claims as baseless attacks from competitors, but the meticulously researched article and the sheer volume of personal testimonies made his denials ring hollow. The public, now fully engaged in this autopsy of corporate integrity, watched as the internal pathology of Sterling Innovations, once hidden, was laid bare for all to see. The very mechanisms of public perception that Alastair had so expertly manipulated were now turning against him, echoing the growing chorus of condemnation. The sustained public and regulatory pressure proved to be the undoing of Alastair Sterling's carefully constructed empire. The formal investigations escalated, culminating in a series of highly publicized hearings where scientific experts, some privately consulted by Margaret, testified to the dubious claims and questionable manufacturing practices of Sterling Innovations. Facing mounting legal fees, plummeting stock prices, and a consumer boycott that crippled sales, key investors began to withdraw their support, demanding a change in leadership. The board of directors, desperate to salvage what little remained of the company's value, delivered the final, fatal blow. In a terse, almost identical announcement to the one that had decimated Vance Therapeutics years prior, Alastair Sterling's resignation was announced, citing personal health reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. It was the corporate death knell, a thinly veiled euphemism for being forced out in disgrace. Sterling Innovations, now stripped of its charismatic leader and facing unprecedented public distrust, struggled to survive. Its wellness products were pulled from shelves, and its once dominant market share evaporated. The company, once a symbol of aggressive corporate success, eventually filed for bankruptcy, its assets quietly liquidated. Margaret watched the news from her small, quiet office, a sense of profound, almost surgical, satisfaction settling within her. Her father, though still frail, showed glimmers of his old self, finding a measure of peace in the quiet vindication. The family legacy, though physically gone, had been ethically restored. Margaret hadn't sought to destroy Alastair Sterling physically or financially in a grand, explosive gesture. Instead, she had used her profound understanding of hidden details and systemic flaws, much like diagnosing a fatal disease from microscopic evidence. She had carefully dissected his public image, meticulously exposed his corporate pathology, and allowed the truth, amplified by the very digital networks he once exploited, to deliver the final, devastating diagnosis. Her revenge was an autopsy of deceit, a precise and quiet unraveling that proved that even the most meticulously constructed facades can crumble under the weight of undeniable, forensically unearthed truth, leaving behind nothing but the stark reality of their own moral decay.